It starts with a smell, the unique, almost sweet scent of decay. It's a blend of damp plaster, silverfish, and a century of forgotten memories trapped in horsehair insulation. That was the smell of Blackwood Manor, my family's home in its final days. It was the smell of a slow, dignified death, and I, for years, had been its only mourner. The house wasn't just wood and stone to me. It was the entire library of my childhood, the foundation of my identity. Every creaking floorboard was a sentence, every peeling strip of wallpaper, a paragraph in the story of us. And my father, the man who was supposed to be the head librarian, had just sold the entire collection for pennies on the dollar to be pulped. The call came on a Tuesday. I remember the sky outside my city apartment was the color of a steel filing cabinet, cold and indifferent. My phone buzzed on the granite countertop, and the name displayed was simply Dad. My father, Arthur, wasn't one for casual chats. A call from him usually meant one of two things: a problem with the plumbing at the old house, or a problem with his soul. This time it was both. His voice, when I answered, was thin, stretched taut over a chasm of guilt. "Heidi," he said, his voice raspy. "It's done. I sold the house." I didn't say anything for a moment. The silence was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the air in my lungs. I sank onto a bar stool, my own modern world of glass and steel suddenly feeling flimsy and unreal. "Sold it?" I finally managed to say. "To who?" "Some corporation. A tech developer from the city," he mumbled, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They have one of those anonymous names. Nexus Forward Holdings. They made an all-cash offer, Heidi. No inspections. A fast close." "Your Uncle Marcus," he said. It was the only sensible move. Uncle Marcus. Of course. My father's brother, a man who could calculate the square footage of a family's heart and declare it a poor investment. "And the price, Dad?" I asked. My voice dangerously quiet. He told me. It was a number so insulting, so grotesquely small, that it was less a transaction and more an act of vandalism. It was a fraction of the land value alone, let alone the historic Gilded Age manor that sat upon it. He tried to justify it, the words tumbling out in a torrent of self-flagellation. "The roof is a sieve. The foundation is cracking. The taxes, Heidi, I'm drowning. I had to cut my losses, secure my retirement. It was this or lose it to the bank." He sounded so broken, so utterly defeated, that my anger was immediately complicated by a surge of pity. He saw no other way. He was a man trapped in a crumbling building, and he had just handed the keys to the first person who offered to knock it down. He saw it as an ending, a final tragic chapter in the Blackwood family history. He felt the crushing weight of being the one to let it all go. He had no idea. He had no idea that I had spent the last decade of my life, not just mourning our family's slow decline, but building a fortress. While he was watching the family legacy crumble, I was secretly, obsessively, constructing an empire. My company, Etherian Labs, was a ghost in the machine of the global economy, a silent powerhouse in predictive logistics and AI. And Nexus Forward Holdings, the faceless corporation that had just purchased my soul for a song. It wasn't some faceless developer, it was me. He thought he was cutting his losses. He thought he was surrendering to the inevitable. But I wasn't going to let our story end with a whimper. I was going to restore our home to its former breathtaking glory. And the big reveal, the moment he would understand everything, was scheduled for exactly 1 month from that day. It would happen at the corporate retreat. I was planning to host at the fully restored estate, with him as the guest of honor. It wasn't about revenge. Not really. Not at first. It was about rescue. But as I listened to the hollowed-out sound of my father's voice, a man convinced by his own brother to sell his history for pocket change, a colder, harder thought began to crystallize in my mind. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about revenge, until it was. After I hung up the phone, the world went quiet. The ambient hum of the city outside my window faded into a dull, distant roar, like the sea heard from inside a seashell. I sat there, on a sleek, minimalist bar stool that had cost more than my first car, and I felt the floor drop out from under me. It was a physical sensation, a lurch in my gut, as if the entire skyscraper was tilting on its axis. The betrayal wasn't sharp, like a knife. It was dull and heavy, like a block of concrete settling on my chest, slowly pressing the air out of me. My father, my quiet, intellectual, history professor father, had taken the most sacred text of our family and sold it for scrap. And in that moment of profound loss, the present dissolved and I was flung backwards in time. The sterile white walls of my apartment melted away, replaced by the faded floral wallpaper of the sunroom at Blackwood Manor. I was 8 years old again. The air was thick with the scent of my mother's jasmine, and the warm dusty smell of sun-baked wood. My mother, Eleanor, was there, her hands covered in soil from her rose bushes, a smudge of dirt on her cheek that she was completely unaware of. She was laughing, a sound like wind chimes. As she repotted an orchid, she told me the house had its own breath, its own life. In the summer it inhaled the sweet green air of the valley. In the winter it held its breath under a blanket of snow, dreaming of spring. She believed it, and she made me believe it too. Blackwood Manor wasn't a mansion to me then. It was a playground, a kingdom. The grand, two-story library wasn't a collection of rare first editions. It was a forest of towering shelves where I could play hide-and-seek for hours, breathing in the intoxicating perfume of old paper, leather, and lemon polish. The winding servants' staircase was a secret passage to another world. The dusty attic, with its abandoned steamer trunks and shrouded furniture, was a treasure island where my imagination was the only map I needed. I knew every loose floorboard, every window that rattled in the wind, every secret nook and forgotten cranny. My mother would find me curled up in a window seat with a book, the afternoon sun warming my face, and she'd say, "You're like a little cat, Heidi. You always find the warmest, quietest spot in the house. You're a part of it." Then, she was gone. Cancer came like a thief in the night, and stole the life from her, and with her, it stole the life from the house. Her passing left a vacuum that my father, in his quiet, academic grief, could never fill. He retreated into his books, into the past, while the present, the house around him, began to crumble. It started small, a patch of damp on the ceiling of the ballroom, the jasmine in the sunroom withering from neglect. Then the problems grew, metastasizing like the disease that had taken my mother. The roof began to leak, not just a drip but a steady mournful weeping that left water stains like tears on the plaster. The porch swing my grandfather had built, the one where my mother had sung me lullabies, fell silent, its chain rusted through. The house became a physical manifestation of our family's grief. Its decay mirrored our own. I would come home from college on weekends and try to fight it. I'd spend hours cleaning gutters, patching plaster, weeding the overgrown gardens until my hands were raw. But it was like trying to fill the ocean with a thimble. My father would watch me, a sad, distant look in his eyes. "It's no use, Heidi," he'd say. "It's too much for us now. The soul has left the building." And that's when my uncle Marcus began to circle. Marcus, my father's younger brother, was a man who measured life in profit and loss. He was a real estate developer, with a portfolio of soulless suburban subdivisions, and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had always resented Blackwood Manor. He saw it as a financial drain, a monument to a past that had no cash value. I remember one particularly brutal argument, about 5 years ago. I'd come home for Christmas. The house was freezing, the ancient boiler was on the fritz again, and my father was huddled in the kitchen, the only room that was tolerably warm. Marcus arrived in his gleaming German sedan, wearing a cashmere coat, and an expression of deep pity that was more insulting than any sneer. He didn't even take his coat off. He stood in the grand foyer, looking up at the water stain on the ceiling, and shook his head. "Arthur, this is a farce," he said, his voice echoing in the cold, cavernous space. "You're living in a museum that's actively trying to kill you. Look at this place. It's a ruin." "It's our home, Marcus," my father had replied, his voice barely a whisper. "It was Mom and Dad's home. It's an asset, Arthur. A depreciating asset." Marcus's voice rose, sharp and impatient. "You're sitting on 5 acres of prime Hudson Valley land, letting it rot because of some misplaced sentimentality. Sell it. Sell it now. Take the money and buy a nice condo in Florida. Play golf, live a little. It's not about the money, Marcus, I had interjected, stepping between them. I was furious, my hands shaking. This is our history. Mom loved this house. Marcus had turned his cold eyes on me. Your mother, bless her heart, was a romantic. Heidi, she didn't have to pay the heating bills. He then turned back to my father. It's just brick and wood, Arthur. Get your head out of the clouds before the roof caves in on you. That argument created a rift that never healed. It also planted a seed of poison in my father's mind. For the next 5 years, Marcus watered that seed with a steady drip of negativity. Phone calls about rising property taxes, articles he'd send about the cost of historic renovations, casual mentions of fantastic offers from developers that were probably fictitious. He was playing the long game, wearing my father down, framing the sale not as a betrayal of legacy, but as a sensible, logical escape. A week after the sale, my father called me again. He sounded even worse than before. He had been to the house to pack up the last of his things, and had seen the preliminary survey stakes pounded into the lawn. He was weeping, not loudly, but with the quiet, gut-wrenching sobs of a man who knows he's made a terrible, irreversible mistake. He kept repeating my mother's name. Eleanor would never forgive me. I let her down, Heidi. I let everyone down. And then he told me the rest. Marcus had handled the whole negotiation. He'd presented the offer from Nexus Forward Holdings as a one-time only take-it-or-leave-it deal. He'd brought spreadsheets, charts and terrifying estimates for repairs. A new roof, $100,000. Foundation work, another $150. A new boiler, $30,000. He'd made my father feel like the choice was between this lowball offer or complete financial ruin. I just signed where he told me to sign. My father confessed, his voice choked with shame. I didn't even read all the fine print. I just wanted the noise to stop. Marcus said it was for the best. The noise. That was Marcus's strategy. Overwhelm a grieving, tired man with so much noise that he couldn't hear the quiet voice of his own heart. I listened to him, my own heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. The pity was still there, but now it was mixed with a new, harder emotion. It was resolve. A resolve as cold and clear as ice. My father was a victim in this. Yes, but he was also a willing one. He had allowed himself to be convinced that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. He ended the call with the words that would become my mission statement. He sighed, a sound of utter finality. I just wish someone who loved it could have saved it. But that's a fairy tale. Heidi, we're not in a fairy tale. He was wrong. We were in a fairy tale. He just didn't know that I was the one holding the pen. He thought the story was over. I was about to write a whole new chapter. My grief for the house, for my mother, for the father I used to have, coalesced into a single diamond-hard point of purpose. I wasn't just going to fix a house. I was going to resurrect a dream. I was going to wage a one-woman war against despair, and I was going to win. The decision to keep my life a secret from my father hadn't been a single dramatic choice. It was a slow accretion of small evasions that over a decade had built a wall between us as solid as any brick and mortar. It started in my sophomore year of college. I was a computer science major, but my real education was happening after midnight in my dorm room. That's where Etherian Labs was born. It started as a simple coding project, an algorithm designed to predict supply chain disruptions with uncanny accuracy. It was a game to me, at first. A puzzle to be solved. But then the puzzle started solving real-world problems, and the game started attracting real-world attention. A professor saw its potential. A startup incubator offered me a grant. By the time I graduated, I had a handful of employees, a portfolio of angel investors, and a product that was quietly revolutionizing the world of global logistics. I told my father I'd gotten a good job with a tech company. He was proud, in his distant academic way. He was a history professor. The intricacies of venture capital and Series A funding were as foreign to him as ancient Sumerian. And I let him believe it. I let him believe I was just another cog in the machine, not the one who had designed the engine. Why? The reasons are complex, a tangled knot of love, fear, and guilt. I saw what new money did to old families. I had friends whose relationships with their parents had become transactional the moment their startup went public. Every conversation was laced with the unspoken question of money. I didn't want that. I wanted my father to see me, Heidi, his daughter, not Heidi, the CEO with a net worth that would make his head spin. I wanted his love, not his awe, or even worse, his resentment. And there was a deeper fear. My father was a man who valued intellect, history, and the tangible world of books and artifacts. My world was abstract, digital, and built on a currency of data that he couldn't see or touch. I was terrified that he would see my success not as an achievement, but as a betrayal of the values he had raised me with. That he would view my wealth as somehow shallow or unearned compared to his lifetime of quiet, scholarly work. And his pride. Oh, his pride. He was a man who had never asked for a thing in his life. The thought of him knowing I could solve all his financial problems with a single wire transfer was unbearable. He would never accept it. He would see it as charity, a handout from his child, an insult to his role as a provider, even though that role had long since overwhelmed him. So, I built the wall. I kept my two worlds separate. In one I was Heidi, the dutiful daughter who worried about the leaky roof at the old family home. In the other, I was H.M. Blackwood, the enigmatic founder of Etherian Labs. That separation, that carefully constructed lie, was what gave me the power to act when my father called with his devastating news. While he was talking to Heidi, his daughter, it was H.M. Blackwood, who was already planning the countermove. The first person I called was Clara. Clara Martinez had been my college roommate, my first employee, and was now the unflappable chief operating officer of Etherian Labs. She was the only person in the world who knew both Heidis. She was the keeper of my secrets, the voice of reason that tempered my wilder impulses. I found her in her office, a minimalist space overlooking the city, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy she radiated. I told her everything: the phone call, the sale, the insulting price, the role Uncle Marcus had played. She listened patiently, her expression shifting from sympathy to a familiar steely anger on my behalf. "That bastard," she said, referring to Marcus. "He's been waiting for this moment for years. He saw your dad as a weak link in his portfolio. So what are you going to do? Sue them?" "No," I said, my voice flat. "Suing is messy and public, and it wouldn't save the house. It would just tie it up in litigation until it collapsed on its own. I have another idea." I laid it all out: the anonymous LLC, the cash offer, the plan to buy it out from under them without them ever knowing I was involved. I watched her face as I spoke, waiting for the inevitable "you're crazy." It came, but with a twist. She leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "This is certifiably insane, Heidi," she said. "It's the most gloriously, beautifully, extravagantly insane thing you've ever proposed. I love it. Let's do it." Clara was my rock, but she was also my enabler. She loved a challenge, and the audacity of my plan appealed to her renegade spirit. Within the hour, she had our corporate legal team on a conference call. We needed a shell corporation, and we needed it yesterday. It had to be completely firewalled from Etherian Labs, untraceable back to me. They proposed a name, something bland and corporate. I rejected it. "It needs to sound like the future," I said. "Something that sounds both innovative and utterly soulless. Something Marcus would fall for." Nexus Forward Holdings was born an hour later, a legal fiction created in a Delaware law office, a ghost designed to haunt my uncle. The next step was hiring the right proxy. We couldn't make the offer ourselves. We needed a buffer, a cutout who would handle the negotiations. Clara found him, a veteran real estate lawyer in Poughkeepsie, named Mr. Gable, a man known for his discretion and his ironclad NDAs. I never even spoke to him. All communication went through Clara's firewalled email. He was given a simple directive: acquire the Blackwood property at the asking price, no matter how low, all cash. Close in 10 days. Do not, under any circumstances, negotiate upwards. Gable's report, when it came back through Clara, was chillingly confirming. He said, and I remember the email verbatim: "The seller's representative, a Mr. Marcus Blackwood, accepted the initial offer without a single counter. His only question was how quickly the funds could be wired. He seemed, for lack of a better word, eager to liquidate." Eager to liquidate. He wasn't just selling a house, he was dumping a liability. He was cashing out his brother's heart and soul. That email solidified it for me. Any lingering guilt I had about deceiving my father vanished, replaced by a cold fury directed at my uncle. My father was a pawn in Marcus's greedy game. But buying the house was only the first step. Saving it was the real challenge. While the lawyers were drafting the paperwork, I was assembling a different kind of army. For years I had been watching the house decay from afar, and in my mind I had already been rebuilding it. Now I put that fantasy into motion. I reached out to Julian Vance, a renowned historical preservation architect I'd once heard lecture at a fundraiser. I sent him an anonymous email with the original 1905 blueprints of Blackwood Manor, which I had tracked down and digitized from the county archives years ago, filed away for a day I never thought would come. I told him I represented a client who had just acquired a historic property and wanted to fund a cost-is-no-object restoration, with a 1-month deadline. Vance was intrigued by the challenge and the mystery. He agreed. He in turn assembled his dream team, master carpenters from New England, who specialized in Gilded Age woodwork, stonemasons from Pennsylvania, a landscape architect who could work from the faded photographs and detailed planting journals my mother had left behind. They were all put on retainer, ready to move the second the property closed. My private wealth manager set up a separate account, a war chest for the restoration, and gave Vance's firm access. The plan was a logistical masterpiece, a secret, high-stakes ballet of lawyers, architects and craftsmen. It was the biggest project Ethereum Labs had ever undertaken, and it had nothing to do with data or algorithms. It was about resurrecting a single, irreplaceable piece of the past. It was about proving that some things, the things that truly matter, are not assets to be liquidated, they are treasures to be saved. And as the pieces fell into place, the scale of what I was doing began to dawn on me. This was more than a renovation, it was a resurrection. And the cost in money was astronomical. But the cost of doing nothing, of letting my family's legacy be bulldozed into a pile of rubble and regret, was infinitely higher. The day the sale closed was one of the strangest of my life. I was in a board meeting, discussing quarterly revenue projections, my face a mask of professional calm. Meanwhile, my phone, lying face down on the table, vibrated with a single text from Clara. "The Eagle has landed. The keys are with Gable." I felt a jolt, a current of pure terrifying ownership. Blackwood Manor was mine. Legally, completely, secretly mine. I made an excuse and left the meeting. I couldn't be in that sterile, air-conditioned room a moment longer. I drove for 2 hours, leaving the city behind, the landscape slowly shifting from concrete and glass to the familiar green hills of the Hudson Valley. I had Gable leave the old heavy brass keys under a loose stone by the back door, the same place my mother used to hide a spare. My fingers trembled as I retrieved them, the metal cold against my skin. Letting myself into the back kitchen, the silence that greeted me was absolute. It was a heavy, weighted silence, full of dust and disappointment. The air was thick with that smell I remembered, the smell of decay. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing like gunshots in the stillness. The movers had taken my father's furniture, leaving behind ghostly outlines on the dusty floors and faded squares on the wallpaper. The house felt immense, hollowed out, a great beached whale, sighing its last breath. I ran my hand along the mahogany banister of the grand staircase, its polish worn away by a century of hands, including my own, small and sticky, as a child. I stood in the center of the ballroom, under the skeletal frame of the crystal chandelier, now shrouded in cobwebs. I could almost hear the faint, ghostly strains of a waltz, almost see my parents dancing here at their wedding reception, a story my mother had told me 100 times. In that moment, standing alone in the cavernous ruin of my past, I wasn't a powerful CEO. I was a little girl who had lost her mother, and was now in danger of losing the last physical piece of her. The weight of my decision, the sheer audacity of it, pressed down on me. What if I couldn't do it? What if the decay was too deep, the rot too pervasive? A wave of doubt washed over me, cold and sickening. But then my eyes fell on a faint pencil mark on the doorframe, leading to the kitchen, a series of lines and dates, marking my growth from a small child to a gangly teenager. Heidi, age 10. My father's neat academic script. That small, insignificant detail was an anchor. It grounded me. This wasn't just a building. It was the repository of my life. My doubt hardened back into resolve. The next morning, the silence was shattered. At precisely 7 a.m., a fleet of vehicles turned up the long gravel driveway, not bulldozers and demolition crews, but vans filled with craftsmen, artisans, and preservation experts. Julian Vance, the architect, was there to lead the charge, his eyes alight with the passion of a man about to save a masterpiece. The restoration was a military campaign waged against time and decay. It was an onslaught of creation. The first week was about triage. A massive tent, like something from a disaster relief effort, was erected over the entire house to protect it from the elements, while the roofers worked, stripping away decades of failed patches and laying down new slate, identical to the original. Inside, teams moved with methodical precision. Damaged plaster was carefully cut away, lath and horsehair exposed. Rotted floorboards were pried up, numbered, and set aside to be replicated by carpenters who worked from a mobile workshop set up in the old stables. The sound of saws and hammers, the shouts of foremen, the hum of generators. It was the sound of the house being brought back to life, its slow dying sigh replaced by the rhythmic pulse of rebirth. I stayed away, mostly. I managed the project remotely, through daily encrypted video calls with Vance. It was too painful to be there, to see the house in its dissected state, but I was intimately involved in every decision. We used my mother's old journals, which I had saved from the house, to guide the replanting of the gardens. We discovered her original orders for rose bushes from a nursery that was miraculously still in business. We ordered the same varieties. We had a specialist from Boston come down to analyze the original paint layers, scraping away a century of coats to find the exact luminous shades of cream and blue that my mother had loved. Meanwhile, I maintained a carefully curated line of communication with my father. He had moved into a small, soulless rental apartment a few towns over. He sounded adrift, lost. About 2 weeks into the project, he called me, his voice a mixture of confusion and anxiety. "Heidi, I did something foolish today," he said. I drove by the old house, my heart hammered against my ribs. "What did you see, Dad?" I don't understand. There's a massive operation underway. It's lit up all night. Floodlights, scaffolding everywhere. There are dozens of workers. It looks like they're rebuilding Versailles." He sounded utterly bewildered. "The broker, your Uncle Marcus, he swore this Nexus company was just buying it for the land value. He said they'd probably let it sit for a few years before knocking it down. But this is a massive investment. Why would a soulless corporation do this?" He was genuinely worried that they were destroying the last vestiges of the home's character, gutting it to create some sort of sterile corporate event space. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. He was panicking about the very act of salvation he had dreamed of. He was afraid I was destroying the thing I was moving heaven and earth to save. My Uncle Marcus, on the other hand, was ecstatic. He called me a few days later, his voice slick with smug satisfaction. He'd just returned from a Caribbean cruise, a trip undoubtedly financed by his commission from the sale. He was feigning sympathy for my father's melancholy, but was really calling to gloat. "Heard you were talking to your dad," he said. "Poor guy's all sentimental about that money pit. See, Heidi, good thing we sold when we did. The place was a disaster. Let some tech bros with more money than sense waste a fortune on it. We got out at the perfect time." I just listened, my grip on the phone tightening. We got out. The sheer gall of it. He had never been in. He was a visitor, a critic, a vulture. He had no right to use the word we. "It's a shame," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Dad really loved that house." "Yeah, well, love doesn't pay the bills," he said, with a chuckle. He thought he was giving me a lesson in pragmatism. He had no idea he was talking to the tech bro with more money than sense. He had no idea that every dollar being wasted on that house was a testament to a kind of love he could never comprehend. The silent takeover was complete. The battlefield was secured. Now all that was left was to prepare for the final reveal. The concept of a family exodus, in the scripts I'd studied, usually meant a dramatic moment where the protagonist cuts off the toxic family, forcing them out of their life. For me, the exodus was quieter, more literal, and infinitely more painful. It happened the day before the sale closed, the day my father packed the last of his personal belongings from Blackwood Manor. I drove up from the city to help him, to bear witness to this final gutting surrender. The house was already an echo of itself. The grand rooms were stark and empty, amplifying every sound. The air smelled of cardboard boxes, and the ghosts of a life that had been lived there. My father moved like a man in a dream, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have aged him a decade in a matter of weeks. We worked in near silence, taping up boxes filled with his books, his clothes, the few remaining photographs of my mother. It was in his study, a room that had always been his sanctuary, that the dam finally broke. He was taking down a framed map of ancient Rome, his hands clumsy. He stopped and just stood there, his back to me, his head bowed. "There was a clause in your grandmother's will," he said, his voice thick and uneven. "I found it when I was clearing out the safe. I'd forgotten all about it." He turned to face me, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. "She stipulated that Blackwood Manor should, in her words, always remain a home for the Blackwood family, a light in the valley, a home, not an asset, not a plot of land, a home." He sank into his old leather armchair, the only piece of furniture left in the room. "I've broken it, Heidi. I've broken a sacred trust. I let Marcus talk me into it. He made it all sound so logical, so necessary. But it wasn't. It was a failure of nerve, a failure of love." I sat on a packing box opposite him, my own heart aching in sympathy. There was nothing I could say. To comfort him would be to lie, to agree that it was over, and I couldn't do that. So I just sat with him in his grief, the silence in the room a testament to everything we had lost. This moment, this raw confession of his guilt and regret, was crucial. It was the proof I needed that his decision had come from a place of despair, not malice. It made my secret plan feel less like a deception and more like an act of grace. 3 weeks later, the world had changed. The frantic 24/7 restoration was nearing its impossible deadline. Julian Vance, the architect, had sent me the final progress photos. The transformation was miraculous. The house wasn't just repaired, it was reborn. The new slate roof gleamed in the sun. The fresh paint was the color of cream. The gardens, thanks to a small army of landscapers, were already bursting with life. Blackwood Manor was no longer a ruin, it was a masterpiece. It was time to set the final stage. I called my father. I took a deep breath and shifted into the persona of H.M. Blackwood's daughter. My voice was crisp, professional, a little distant. "Hi, Dad. How are you holding up?" He gave a non-committal answer, his voice still tinged with that persistent sadness. I didn't linger on it. I launched into the script I had rehearsed in my head a dozen times. "The reason I'm calling is that my company, Etherian Labs, is hosting a very important event next weekend. It's a retreat for our top-tier leadership and some of our key investors, and I'd really like you to be there." "A what?" he asked, confused. "A retreat. Heidi, what are you talking about?" "It's a big deal for me, Dad," I continued, pushing forward. "It's a chance for me to, well, to show you what I've actually been doing all these years. I've been so private about my work, and I'd like to change that. I want you to see it. I've arranged for you to be my +1. He was hesitant, just as I knew he would be. "An executive retreat? Heidi, I'm a retired history professor. I'll be completely out of place with all those corporate sharks. What would I even talk to them about?" This was the delicate part, the gentle manipulation required to get him there. "It would be a small group," I lied. "Very intimate. And honestly, Dad, it's not about them, it's about you and me. It's important to me that you're there. Please." I heard him sigh on the other end of the line. He was too tired, too defeated to argue. And a part of him, I think, was genuinely curious about the mysterious life his daughter lived. "Where is this thing, anyway?" he asked. "It's at a private estate in the Hudson Valley," I said, my heart starting to pound. "A beautifully restored historic property. My company booked it for the weekend. I'll pick you up on Saturday morning. All right, Heidi, he said, a note of resignation in his voice. If it's that important to you, I'll be there. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. The power shift was complete. For his entire life, he had been the one in charge of our family's story, our family's home. He had made the decision to end that story. Now I was in control. I had secretly written a new ending, and I was about to invite him to the premiere. He thought he was going to a corporate retreat to see his daughter's modest success. He had no idea he was about to walk back into the first chapter of the rest of his life. The Saturday of the retreat arrived under a sky of impossible cloudless blue. It was the kind of crisp, perfect autumn day that existed more in memory than in reality. I picked my father up from his rental apartment. He was wearing a blazer that looked a little too big for him now, and he held a book in his hands, a biography of some Roman emperor, like a shield. He looked nervous, out of his element, a scholar being dragged into the Colosseum. The drive was quiet at first. He asked a few polite, stilted questions about my work, and I gave him vague, practiced answers. But as we left the highway and turned onto the winding country roads of the Hudson Valley, a change came over him. His posture stiffened. He put his book down and stared out the window, a look of deep furrowed confusion on his face. These roads, he murmured, more to himself than to me. They're very familiar. I kept my eyes on the road, my own heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I know, I said simply. He fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was alert, tense. He was connecting the dots, but the picture they were forming was impossible, nonsensical. With every turn, his confusion grew. That old oak tree, the stone wall. Heidi, this is the way to the old house. What's going on? Where are you taking me? We're almost there, Dad, I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. And then we made the final turn. I slowed the car as we approached the entrance to the long, familiar driveway, but the entrance wasn't the same. The crumbling stone pillars had been rebuilt. The rusted iron gates were gone, replaced by elegant new ones that stood wide open in welcome. My father gasped. It was a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. He stared, his eyes wide with disbelief, and as I turned the car into the driveway, the full breathtaking panorama of Blackwood Manor came into view. It was no longer a ruin. It was a jewel. The house stood proud and pristine, its cream-colored facade glowing in the afternoon sun. The new slate roof was a crown of deep gray. Every window pane sparkled. The shutters were painted a deep, lustrous black. And the gardens were a riot of color, a perfect living recreation of my mother's proudest achievement. The lawn was a carpet of perfect green, and the porch swing, my mother's porch swing, was back in its place, its chain gleaming. I pulled the car to a stop at the base of the circular drive and turned off the engine. The only sound was my father's ragged breathing. He didn't move. He just stared, his mind clearly struggling to process the impossible sight before him. He looked from the house, to me, and back to the house again. Who? He finally whispered, his voice cracking. Who did this? How is this possible? Is this the right place? I let the question hang in the air for a long, resonant moment. I savored it. This was the culmination of everything. The secret years, the sleepless nights, the risk, the expense. It all came down to this single, perfect, heart-stopping moment of revelation. I turned to him, my expression calm, and I finally told him the truth. Nexus Forward Holdings is a subsidiary of my company, Dad. There is no corporate retreat. There are no investors. There's just us. I unsnapped my seatbelt. Welcome home. I got out of the car. He remained inside, frozen, for a full minute. Then the car door opened slowly, and he emerged, moving like a man in a trance. He walked a few steps onto the gravel, his eyes scanning every impossible detail: the freshly painted trim, the gleaming brass knocker on the front door, the smoke curling from one of the chimneys. His face was a canvas of conflicting emotions: utter confusion, dawning comprehension, a flicker of fear, and then finally a wave of such profound, overwhelming wonder that it seemed to buckle his knees. Tears began to stream down his face. Not the quiet, grief-stricken tears I had seen before, but tears of shock and joy, and a level of gratitude so immense it left him speechless. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. I walked over to him and took his hand. It was trembling violently. "I had to, Dad," I said softly. "It was the only way. I knew you'd never accept the money from me. Your pride wouldn't have allowed it. So I had to buy it. I had to save it." He finally found his voice, a choked, broken whisper. "Your company, Etherian Labs. This is all you." I nodded. He shook his head, a dazed, uncomprehending laugh escaping his lips. He looked back at the house, then at me, and the full weight of my deception, my grand, loving, extravagant deception, finally settled on him. He understood the secrecy. He understood the lengths I had gone to. He understood that I hadn't done it to shame him, but to heal him, to heal us. Just as this profound, fragile moment was settling between us, another car, a flashy, obnoxious sports car, came roaring up the driveway. It screeched to a halt behind mine, and out stepped Uncle Marcus. He was dressed in golf attire, a smug, predatory grin on his face. He had clearly heard about the corporate event, and had come uninvited to network and gloat. His grin faltered as he took in the scene, the perfectly restored house. Me, my father, with tears streaming down his face. The gears were turning in his head, his shrewd, calculating mind, trying to make sense of the scene. "Arthur? Heidi? What's all this?" he asked, his voice losing its confident swagger. "I thought the techies were having a party. What happened? Did they flip it already?" My father, who just moments before had been a man undone by emotion, suddenly drew himself up to his full height. A lifetime of quiet dignity returned to him, fortified by the incredible truth of what I had done. He turned to his brother, his eyes clear and cold with a newfound strength. "There are no techies, Marcus," he said, his voice ringing with an authority I hadn't heard in years. "You pressured me into selling our family's legacy for a pittance. You preyed on my grief for your own greed." He gestured towards me. "My daughter bought it back. She bought it back with love and hard work. Two concepts you wouldn't understand." Marcus stared, his jaw slack, his face paling. He looked from me to the house, the full humiliating scope of the situation, finally crashing down on him. He had been outmaneuvered, made a fool of. He had celebrated his petty victory, never imagining that the tech bro he so casually dismissed was his own niece, undoing his grubby work with a vision, and a fortune he couldn't even fathom. He looked like he had been slapped. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and without another word, he got back in his garish car, and sped away, leaving a cloud of gravel and shame in his wake. My father watched him go, then turned back to me. The vindication was complete, not just for me, but for him. He was no longer the man who had lost his home. He was the man whose daughter had brought it back from the dead. The corporate retreat was a fiction. Of course. There were no executives, no investors, no team-building exercises. There was only the house, my father and me. After my uncle's hasty, humiliating departure, I led my father inside. He walked through the familiar rooms as if in a sacred daze, his hand trailing along the freshly painted walls, his eyes taking in every restored detail. He stopped in the library, now filled not with my books, but with his. While the house was being restored, I had my team move his entire collection from his depressing rental apartment, and arrange them on the shelves exactly as they had been. He ran his hand over the spines of his beloved histories, his shoulders shaking with silent emotion. For the rest of the weekend, we just existed in the space. We didn't talk about my company or the money. We talked about my mother. We sat on the new porch swing, and my father told me stories about their early years in the house, stories I had never heard before. He spoke of the day he proposed to her in the garden, right by the old oak tree. He talked about bringing me home from the hospital, a tiny bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket, and how the house had seemed to welcome me with a warm sunlit sigh. We were healing. The house was no longer a symbol of our grief and decline. It was the catalyst for our reconciliation. In restoring the physical structure, I had somehow managed to restore the emotional foundation of our family. He wasn't burdened by guilt anymore. He was filled with a quiet, profound pride that was humbling to witness. The house was legally, indisputably mine, but that weekend, it became ours again, in a way it hadn't been since my mother was alive. And now, as I'm telling you this story, I'm sitting in that very library, the smell of old books and fresh beeswax in the air. My father is in the garden, tending to the roses my mother planted, his face turned towards the sun. He is home. So what's the moral of this crazy, extravagant story? I guess it's about the nature of value. We live in a world that is constantly telling us to cut our losses, to be pragmatic, to liquidate our assets. We're told that sentimentality is a weakness, and that history is a liability. My uncle Marcus believed that. For a little while, he even made my father believe it. He thought he was being a savvy businessman, but he was just a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. He thought my father had to cut his losses, but what he didn't realize is that some things, the things that truly define us, are priceless. Our memories, our heritage, our connections to the people and places that shaped us. You can't put a number on those things. They are the only assets that truly matter. This whole journey, it was never really about revenge against my father, it was about revenge against despair. It was a rebellion against the idea that we have to surrender to decay, that we have to let the things we love crumble into dust because it's the sensible thing to do. Sometimes the most sensible thing you can do is the most irrational, audacious, and gloriously impractical thing imaginable. Sometimes you have to fight for the fairy tale. You have to be willing to rebuild the castle, not because you expect to live happily ever after, but because the castle is worth saving. It's a testament to the fact that you were there, that you loved, and that you remembered. My father lost his way because he was overwhelmed by the cost of maintaining the past. I was lucky enough to be in a position where I could afford it, but it wasn't the money that saved Blackwood Manor, it was the will to do it. It was the belief that this place, this story, was worth fighting for. If you've ever had to fight for something that everyone else told you to give up on, a dream, a relationship, a piece of your own personal history, I want to hear about it. Tell me your story in the comments below. What's the priceless thing that you refuse to let go of? Your stories remind us all what's truly worth preserving in this world. And if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about fighting for what matters. Thanks for listening.